right, everybody. So we're ready to move on to kind of the next section of the course, which is the front end, which is built in. We're choosing React. So React.JS is a framework built on top of Node, and so you're going to notice even to install, React, we're going to need Node installed. As that runtime environment. And so React is basically, for the last 4 or 5 years, the most popular front end framework, out there. Every year, and I know if you know me, you've probably seen me use this source of information before. There's a developer survey on Stack Overflow. They just released their 2023. And so when you go to technology, basically, what are people building with? Of course, JavaScript is number one, but when you look at frameworks, you're going to see that still React is kind of number one. Let's go scroll down. Databases. Scrolling down, cloud. Of course, you got AWS, Azure, and Google. Here's frameworks. Node and React. So there you go. When it comes to front-end frameworks, the big three, Node is obviously a backend, right? So that's a backend framework. React's big competitor is Angular. And I remember it didn't seem that long ago. I was going to conferences and it was like a 50-50 split. It seemed to me that half the developers in the room were like, go React. The other half were like, go Angular, and Vue. That was kind of the third one. And those were kind of three competitors. And React has emerged over time to be the most popular, most used front-end framework. You're going to kind of see React was there to kind of replace what used to be used as jQuery. We used to teach jQuery. I've taught jQuery. I don't know when we started, maybe 2005, 2006, 2007. Taught jQuery for a long time. And within the last 4 or 5 years, started teaching React. In order to work on the front end in React, if you kind of go here, we just finished up our authentication and authorization section. We're moving on here. Building front ends with React, our first thing here is kind of a refresher on HTML and CSS. I'm going to recommend everyone in my class kind of read through this refresher. Of course, you've taken an HTML and CSS class before at Rankin if you're following along with this class, and we've covered all of this theory before. This is essentially prerequisite, right? Knowledge for what we're about to get into. However, it doesn't hurt for you to refresh. So a lot of my assumptions that I'll be operating on are that you're comfortable with both of these languages, everything from CSS, HTML for the structure and content, CSS for the styling, how to link to CSS documents, how to select things in CSS, CSS box model and positioning, moving things around. Flexbox, we have covered CSS Flexbox, and again, moving things around on the page so that it's mobile responsive. And of course, Bootstrap as well uses, or you can use Flexbox in Bootstrap if you go to the Bootstrap docs. Of course, there's the grid system for laying things out in Bootstrap. But if you kind of go down into utilities, you can also just directly use Flexbox by putting classes on. And so I'll be using a little bit of that, a little bit of Flexbox, and inside of Bootstrap. And then again, kind of a review of Flexbox, all the different Flexbox properties. All is just to say, plenty of reading on HTML. And if you need a refresher, please read up. And not going to hit that in too much detail here. The next thing is some notes, intro to React notes. And so, kind of my discussion, I'm going to be going through these notes. And then at the end of the discussion, or at the end of this, we will create our first project with React. And this is what we're going to build today. We're going to build a shopping cart. Now this is a lab for the class, and so this is something I will collect for a grade. And so this is not one of the optional follow-alongs. This is a follow-along for a grade. So you will want to go ahead and follow along. And I'm going to pull these React notes off to the side and introduce React. And so, that's my introduction to React. You still need to know HTML. You still need to know CSS. You still have to know vanilla JavaScript and ES6 as it is, and all the latest JavaScript features. Because React is built on all of that. And just because you learn React doesn't mean that stuff goes away. And this is just a tool to build interfaces. And so then, the question is, well, why? Why would we use React? And you begin to answer that when you understand where React came from. React came from Facebook. Facebook developers built React. It was not open source at first. It was not open to the community. It was just made for Facebook. And, if you've ever used Facebook, it has a lot going on. There's a marketplace, there's a chat feature, there's your feed, your social feed. There are groups, and there are communities, and searching, and there's so much on Facebook I don't even know anymore. Personally, I joined Facebook back when it was thefacebook.com, and it was closed to college students. And so I still had my college email address. They didn't deactivate it. And anyways, I'm guessing this was like 2005, 2006. Facebook was young when I got in. But it's evolved over time, and it became a product that I don't really care to use on a day-to-day basis. All that just to say, I can't even tell you all the different features that Facebook has because I'm not an active user. But I know it's a very complex UI, okay? And that's understating it, okay? There's a lot of moving pieces. And so the developers at Facebook wanted to create a system where you could say, you can see right here, create user interfaces from components. Okay, so if you think about the different features of Facebook, you say, I want to make a component. I'm going to make this chat component, and this marketplace component, and this feed component. And you can have these different components that need to play nice together, but that are kind of reusable, and the benefit of smaller reusable code. When you think about a component, you think about a small interface, a small piece of an interface that's reusable. You think it's not, the code complexity isn't as complex because it's a smaller piece of the interface. It's not everything all at once, but you're building smaller pieces at a time. And so what happens when you have smaller code chunks is that they're easier to troubleshoot, they're easier to maintain, they're easier to reuse. And so React was birthed 12 years ago at Facebook. Um, 10 years ago, 2013, they said, hey, this is a really useful tool, and let's open it up to the community. And so, about 2013, they made it open source. And, you know, let me pull up. When they made it open source, that's when it started to gain popularity. So it's really only been around 10 years. It's been on my radar at least 3 to 5 years. Like I said before that, I was teaching jQuery, and jQuery was a JavaScript library that was really good at getting like animations. And so it's a little bit different, quite a bit different what jQuery was, but you can kind of look at React as like a newer framework for the front end over jQuery. And so jQuery adoption's really gone down. In fact, Bootstrap used to implement jQuery, but now it doesn't. Like if you go to the docs, they're no longer bringing in jQuery. It used to be a requirement. It used to be jQuery was a dependency of Bootstrap, and it's no longer. So jQuery is kind of fading out a little bit. Again, you can kind of see here jQuery is there, but not as much as React. And so, you could view it as a replacement to jQuery. And again, Facebook's pretty complex. It needed a better tool than jQuery to achieve what Facebook needed to achieve, which was a very complex user interface. About 5 years ago, React. So what do we need to know about React? It's a framework. It's a popular framework, and it's all about these things called components. Components are small, reusable chunks of code. You can kind of see a component here, where if I scroll, so this is right on their home page. Let me show you. So you're going to notice here they're creating this thing called video list. Okay, and we'll get into this is what's going on here. But notice there's a video. Inside of the video, you put a video list, and so these are kind of like these are the components. And these components are created with JavaScript functions. And what that allows us to do is actually create this tag right here. And so a component ends up being a reusable tag, very much like HTML, right? In HTML, you have these tags that you can reuse, like an H1 tag or a div tag. And so with JavaScript, we're creating these components, and then we are bringing these components in like HTML tags, and you can reuse them, and thus the benefit of reusable components. As you can kind of see here, they've got these different video elements inside of a video list, and that's kind of the idea behind components. Now, because I was thinking about this yesterday, and again, I've been doing React somewhere between, I don't know, we'll call it 3 to 5 years, probably closer to 3. So I guess the reason I say that is it's still kind of young for me. I've been doing it, and I'm decent, but it's not like HTML, which I've been doing my whole life. So I asked ChatGPT. I I said, why are components in React useful? And I kind of already mentioned the reusability, right? Components enable you to create self-contained, reusable code blocks. You can define a component and reuse it multiple times. So it's just kind of a foundational thing about writing code. Code reuse is like the main benefit that you're looking for. You're always looking for reusable code. Modularity. Components allow you to break down your UI into smaller, manageable parts. Again, kind of going into that Facebook, you got this huge UI, break it down into smaller parts. Each component focuses on a specific functionality, making it easier to understand, develop, and maintain. By combining different components, you can create complex UIs while keeping your code base organized and maintainable. Okay, so I kind of hit on that too, right? Is that you don't want to, you're not trying to like solve a huge problem like this big user interface, you know. Instead, you're writing smaller code chunks that are easier to understand, easier to code, and easier to maintain. Abstraction. Components allow you to abstract the implementation details and focus on the high-level structure and behavior of your UI. By encapsulating functionality within components, you can create a clear separation of concerns and achieve a more declarative programming style. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. This is another concept of React that's a little bit different than what you're used to in JavaScript. Okay, so I'm going to do a Control F. I'm going to find the word declarative. What? Okay. Another feature of React, and I can't believe they're not talking about it, is that React is considered declarative. And I cannot believe it used to be on their marketing homepage, is that React is declarative, is a declarative language. And you might be saying, what is a declarative language? And you're going to notice, like, that's not the first question I asked yesterday about my lecture today. The first question was, how would you describe declarative programming to a beginner? Which ChatGPT gave me a great answer. Let me summarize all these paragraphs. In JavaScript, okay, if you remember JavaScript, we had the JavaScript DOM. Grant, you remember the JavaScript DOM?
Yeah.
And so this was basically how you could work with the HTML document, aka, the HTML code, with JavaScript. And if you've written JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, for any amount of time, you remember it's very, it is considered imperative. And what that means is, if you're going to put a new list item on a list, you have to first select the UL. You have to generate a new LI element. You have to insert that LI element into the list exactly where it needs to go. And it's very step by step, right? When you're writing imperative code, you have to give the computer every instruction along the way how it needs to execute your code and how it needs to perform the task at hand. Okay, so JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, is considered imperative, which just means it requires every step along the way. Okay, contrast that with declarative. Okay, HTML. Okay, and I never thought of this until yesterday. ChatGPT pointed it out. HTML is a declarative language. You write this H1 tag, and you say, hey, I want this content to go inside this H1, and it kind of lets, the browser, if you will, do the heavy lifting. Like, what does it need to do to actually get that on the screen? Right? So JavaScript is a little bit different. To get JavaScript to work, you have to be very, every step along the way, you have to define the task at hand and what needs to be done. That's imperative. Step one, step two, step three, step four. Versus declarative. Okay, declarative is like, hey, here's what you need to do. You need to take this text and you need to put it on the screen, and I'm not going to tell you how you need to get there. You just gotta, using the declarative language, it's just going to figure it out for you. Okay, so again, using an H1 as an example, you never tell exactly how that H1 to put that onto the browser window. HTML is a declarative language. It just kinds of figure it out. Okay, now again, I'm ripping off of ChatGPT here, but another kind of real world example is this example of making a sandwich. Okay, and imperative languages like JavaScript, I've sat through lectures of instructors before, and they're like, hey, you want to make a sandwich, how would you describe the process of making a sandwich? And it's kind of like a funny thing. Like, you get two people and they're both like describing step by step what it takes to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And, they're giving as specific detailed implementations as they can. Okay, open up the bread, pull out 2 slices, put the peanut butter on, put the jelly on, combine the sandwiches. And if you just listen to them and follow their instructions, as a computer would, it's kind of a comical thing because you might end up with like very different sandwiches made just listening to the instructions. But the point is, when you're making a sandwich, in an imperative manner, imperative sandwich making is like, hey, you're going to give every step along the way for this person to make a sandwich. Whereas declaratively, you just say, hey, I want a sandwich. Declaratively, you would simply say, I want a sandwich with mayo, lettuce, tomatoes, and turkey. And the programming language or framework would then understand your intent and take care of the implementation details. The reason I'm harping on this quite a bit is because I never fully understood. It was always a confusing thing to me about the difference between declarative versus imperative. And React, you often hear that React is declarative, and it used to be right on their homepage. It's not anymore, so I guess they're not as worried about it. But React is declarative in nature. You just kind of say, hey, I want this data, like right here on the page, and you're gonna leave some implementation details out about maybe what that data looks like, or how to get that data there. For example, again, how to get that data on the page. You might not select the DOM element, for example, and then add a child element to the list in the DOM, right? That's JavaScript. That's imperative. It's very, very implementation. You have to give all the details. And I'm sure as you've written JavaScript, to do a simple task, you might end up with 100 lines of code just to do a very simple task. And so there's kind of the downfall of that. Grant, does that explanation of declarative versus imperative, is that making sense, or?
Yeah.
Okay. They do note on here, again, I'm just kind of cheating by using ChatGPT, but SQL is another declarative language. So SQL and HTML, these languages allow you to describe what you want to achieve rather than explicitly programming the steps to achieve it. And it's like, oh, if you think of HTML as declarative, you're right. I never, I just said image, img, source equals, and I never really thought about what happened behind the scenes to get the image on the browser window. It's not very specific. Okay. Back to my notes. So React, key things about React to learn. Okay, key things. Number one, it's component based. Small reusable components make complex interfaces easier to build just by building piece at a time. It's been around 12 years. or so, open source 10 years ago. About 5 years ago, okay, about 5 years ago, this concept of hooks was created. And when hooks were introduced 5 years ago, it was kind of like a paradigm shift in React. Let's see if I can find the YouTube video. React hooks. Yeah. It used to be, again, a video right on the React page here. And if I go to Learn, let's see if I can find this video that they used to have. About 5 years ago, they started with this concept of working with hooks. And it kind of changed the way you were writing React code. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is because we're going to be writing we're going to be using hooks. And so if you kind of go back, again, it's only been around 10 years, but if you're looking at documentation from like 5 or 6 years ago, or even 4 or 3 years ago, a lot of your components used to be built with JavaScript classes. Okay, but around the time they started introducing these things called hooks, and we'll learn about hooks, components were and are now built using JavaScript functions. And so kind of going here on the React homepage, and again, without even diving deep, you can see we're using functions. And so I want to point out that there's kind of two ways to creating components. Way number one is with JavaScript classes. Way number two, the more modern, is with JavaScript functions. We're going to use functions. Again, that started happening about 5 years ago. And so if you're looking at documentation where components were class-based, you're probably looking at some older documentation. And so yeah, React hooks kind of around that time you started seeing that change. You started using functions instead of classes to create your components. Okay, we already covered imperative versus declarative. We talked about the benefits of declarative programming. You don't have to be as specific in your implementation. Again, there's a lot of, React is going to figure out the implementation specifics. You just have to give it more some generic high-level instructions. Okay, so again, we're going to be building components. Another concept here is this concept in React of what's called the shadow DOM. Okay, and I'm not going to beat this up too much. The JavaScript DOM, as I kind of looked at this here, is the document object model. And when you're writing vanilla JavaScript, you're working with the DOM. When you're working in React, there's this thing that's kind of just in the background. And what it does is that when you're making changes to the user interface, it's changing what's called the shadow DOM, not the DOM itself. And this thing called the shadow DOM runs, kind of a diff. What a diff is if you've used GitHub, you might be familiar with a diff. A diff is like, hey, on GitHub.com, here's your code base. On my local computer, here's my code base. What's the difference? And so this shadow DOM is something in React that looks at your, it compares itself with the DOM, and it runs a diff, and it just updates the part of the DOM that it needs to. So it just updates the piece of the DOM that is necessary. It doesn't have to refresh the whole page. It just refreshes the things that are changing. And that's an important part. If you go back in the history of web pages, it used to be that if you wanted to change any part of your front end, like a whole page refresh would have to happen. That doesn't have to happen anymore with the shadow DOM and technologies like Ajax. You can just refresh a part of the page and not refresh the whole page itself. That's why you could be sitting at gmail.com and you just get a new email. The whole page doesn't have to refresh. Or why you can be on Google Maps and you could just zoom in and it just zooms in. It doesn't have to refresh the whole page. Okay. Shadow DOM itself is considered, I don't know. It doesn't cost a lot, and what I mean by cost a lot is that it's generally considered pretty fast. It's not going to slow the page down. Okay. So again, if I'm kind of just, I'm going off of my notes here. Hopefully you're kind of keeping this in mind. Big things here. React is declarative. React uses components. React has a thing called a shadow DOM, which does a diff between the real DOM and itself. And then JSX. What is JSX? Back on the homepage, JSX, it does talk about JSX here. Take a look at this chunk of code. Well, what you're going to notice is it kind of looks like JavaScript. We've got a function here. This function has, a parameter here. This parameter is an object, and it's got, two things inside of there. So we got some const and some let going on. We got an if statement. And then notice this. We got a return, and then what do we have inside of here? We have some HTML. JSX, very technically, is JavaScript, and the X comes from XML. But it's basically, you're looking at a combination of JavaScript and HTML, right? All the HTML that you're used to. The reason, why it's, not, I don't know, JSH, for HTML, is that it does have some XML-like rules. XML is generally considered like a stricter language than HTML. HTML historically has been very loose. It's not a very strict language. XML, has a little bit more strict rules. Everything has to be lowercase. Every opening tag has to have a closing tag. Everything has to be nested properly. So the language that we're writing here is called JSX. JSX is essentially a combination of JavaScript and HTML, but the X really stands for XML. It's confusing, but it's just like strict HTML. It's important to note that our browsers do not receive JSX. Okay, we're going to write JSX. JSX will be understood by the React server. And what happens is we're going to write JSX, and this process of what's called transpiling, it's going to take our code that we write and convert it, essentially. That's what transpiling essentially means. It's going to convert our JSX code into HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That's what's going to go out the door to the front end. Okay, we're going to write JSX. JSX is going to be handled in the middle tier and send JavaScript, HTML, CSS to the browser. So you could see JSX is what's called a syntax extension made popular by React. This is JSX right here. Again, just looks like HTML and JavaScript combined. So that's the one of the languages, that's the language of React is JSX. It's essentially HTML and JavaScript. This is a mix of JavaScript and XML. Really, I would say JavaScript and HTML, but just with the XML rules, if you will. Okay, JSX code cannot be run on browsers. It's transpiled. You're also going to notice we are using the newer module system in React. And we've been using the newer module system all semester with imports and exports instead of requires. Okay, I just figured, this is where it's all going. So we've been using imports and exports all semester. You're going to continue to see that in React. React uses that out of the gate. Again, components used to be built with classes, but around the time we started seeing hooks, now components are built as functions. Okay, and that's kind of the introduction. That's the high level what you need to know about React before we just start coding. Looking forward, what we're going to do is we're going to build a separate app. The separate app is our front end. We're going to keep the front end code separate from our back end code. And so you don't have to do it that way, but I like keeping them separate, and it's going to help me deploy, because I have another solution for deploying my front end, not to G-Cloud. And so G-Cloud will be my back end, our back end. Again, just pointing this out, that the way that I'm implementing this front end code in this class is going to be to keep it separate, completely separate from the back end. However, I've had, it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, I've had students and I have worked together to kind of make it all one project, and that would work as well. Now, one thing that it kind of makes sense to do is just to come right into the React. I would tell you within the last 7 months, okay, a lot has already changed. I mean, a lot has changed since I taught this 7 months ago. Everything from this tutorial has changed. And actually, I like this, right? So here we're creating a component. This is JSX right here. It's called my button. And notice how that allowed us to create this HTML element called my button. And what that generates is a heading that says, welcome to my app. Yet my button is actually just where we're containing our HTML button. And this button doesn't do anything. But this is already changed. My experience with the tutorial isn't that it's all that great. I don't like anything. You want to learn by, of course, doing the tutorials. I think that's okay. But I've always found the tutorial just a very brief introduction. So, I guess, what am I saying here? It's never a bad idea to go through the learning docs. We're not going to do that here. You can do that on your own time if you choose. It's never a bad idea. I've never found it to be enough. It's just a start. And so we're gonna do hello world in React, And that's, you know, the tradition of learning something new is to do hello world. So I'm just going to, feel free to follow along. This is not the lab part yet. I'm just going to say hello world React. Now, right away, let's make everything lowercase. Hello world React. There's a reason I'm doing that. And the reason is we're about to install React. And when you run this installer, it wants everything to be lowercase. Okay, so something to keep in mind, no spaces and no capital letters. So notice my convention here is with underscores. And I just want to show you, you know, hello world. And see what this looks like out of the gate. I'll go back here to the getting started with React. Getting started with React, and I'm gonna go to installation. So there's quick start, then there's installation. How to start a new React project. And so there's a command, npx create next app, create remix, so next.js is something that we're going to get into. I don't want to start there, but let's see what this says because this has changed. If you want to build a new app or website with React, we recommend picking one of the React frameworks in this community. Frameworks provide features that most apps and sites eventually need, including routing, data fetching, and generating HTML. You need to install Node. Very interesting. Right off the bat, they want you to put a React framework on top of React. And so we will do that, but I don't want to start there. They go through and they explain some different React frameworks. Next.js will be what we use, but not starting there. That's interesting. See, this has all changed. So how are we going to install React? Well, we're going to start right here. We're going to go to the terminal. So let's open this up. Open this up with code. And trust the authors and close it down. Let's go to the terminal. And npx create React app space dot. Okay, so what do we need to know here? Number one, we have a new command. The command is npx, not npm. The difference, npm npm install brings in a package. Okay, you download a dependency. You know that by now. With the npm command, you download dependencies. npx is kind of two things. It both downloads a dependency and runs an installer. So it's a executable. That's what the X is. So we're downloading this dependency, React, and we're running an installer to install it with a bunch of dependencies and basically get it up and running. You know, kind of get it on localhost and do some initial setup for us. It's again important to note you create React app even on their own docs anymore. They don't say to do that. So again, this has changed in the last 7 months, but this is one method that we'll start with. And I guess I would also say, you know, this is not the only way, but I just find it good for learning. That's why I'm starting here. That's why I'm having the class start here. I find this a good template to start from for learning. The package is we're downloading the dependency of React, and we're saying install it in the current directory. That's what this dot means. Just install it in the current directory. And yes. And this will take a minute, and it might error out. Again, if you have capital letters, if you have spaces, those are all things that this doesn't like. I'm pretty sure the underscores are okay, but if it errors out, then I have a pretty good idea that I was wrong about that. This is large. This is a large download and again large install, so it does takes, as it says, this might take a couple of minutes installing React, React DOM, React scripts with a template. Notice it's bringing in node modules. Our next video, our next lab, if you will, we're gonna kind of dive in feet first and build something, the shopping cart, and we're gonna start with a GitHub. You know, we'll start with a repository, GitHub repo. And here we go. Okay. And so underscores were cool. Looks pretty familiar. You know, this is all built on Node, so you do need Node. That's required. We do have our package JSON. You can see some dependencies here. You can see some scripts. And so right here, the command to start it up is called npm start. So here are you know, we don't in our backend code we were saying npm run start -dev. The run command is implied here, so you could say npm run start is the same thing as just saying npm start. Okay, so even if I just npm run start, it says run the script called start. And so that's what we're doing. So you can just very quickly just say npm start. Notice it's booting up on port 3000. And it's the first time it's booting up, and this is what you get out of the template. Okay? And if you go to Learn React, it just takes you to their homepage. Okay? But the important thing here is that this is up and running. Grant, you up and running?
Yep, I've got the same thing.
Cool. So then our next thing to do is kind of just, again, kind of get our feet under us and look around a little bit. So package JSON, we're familiar with that. We got name, version, etc. Private just means that we're not going to make this like an NPM package for others to download. Which is exactly, you know, you don't want to do that. If you ever want to make an NPM package yourself, you know, you're not going to make it private. You know, one thing that you kind of get out of this process of JSX, remember JSX, they call it transpiling, kind of a fun word. It just means converting JSX into HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Is that you get a lot of old browser support, meaning, you know, basically what I generally view old browser support. I mean, who doesn't update their browsers in 2023? Well, some people. Some people, including like the government, like governments in general, technology. If you've ever worked in the government, you've probably worked with old technology. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And so if you go work on Scott Air Force Base and you boot up one of their computers, I wouldn't be surprised to find some old browsers, you know, that they're forced to work with because, you know, because of that. Now, with all the latest push in security, every time you turn on the news, security, 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 you can't have old browsers because that's security vulnerability. So you got to update for security purposes. But just to say, all that just to say, government typically, sometimes people in general just don't update their software. We all know the type. And maybe, I don't know you, Grant, but you go to your phone and you look at all your apps on your phone, and are you the kind of person that updates all the apps automatically, or do you just never update your apps because, again, they don't need them? They don't need the update.
I usually auto update, yeah.
Yeah, everyone's different, right? And so, different types of people. Some people, and I know them. I imagine you know them. They don't update. All that just to say, when you transpile JSX, it has inherent built-in support for all this newer JavaScript that you can write, and it'll make it be understood by old browsers. And so, like, old browsers might not understand const and let because that was introduced in 2015, and before then everything was var. And old browsers from back then might not understand const and let. So if you write const and let in your JSX, it'll be transpiled into an older browser that can understand var instead of const and let, which is kind of cool. So that's nice. Okay, moving on. Public index.html. Okay. Looking at index, this tag right here, this is largely, we're going to let this stay unchanged. Okay. We might change this file a little bit, but you're going to notice basically there's one tag in our homepage called root. Okay. And if you kind of open up the page and go to localhost 3000, I think it's still running. Okay, and I inspect here. Notice everything is inside the div ID of root. Okay, so this is kind of the starting point in the HTML. And let's see, inside of there's a thing called app, then there's an app header, there's our image, which got a simple animation going on for the rotation. And we got our link inside of our header. Just to kind of look again. This script right here is doing all that work for us. And so notice we didn't write any HTML. Okay, we didn't write any HTML, but we wrote some JavaScript. That JavaScript was bundled up inside of a bundle.js, and if you know anything about JavaScript, you know that it can change your HTML. So it's this bundle.js that's executed that generates our HTML, right, from the JavaScript. Okay, so this little script tag right here that's right underneath our title, if I kind of go back here, you don't see that script tag, right? That was generated kind of at runtime, if you will. The bundle. Actually, the bundle was right underneath the title, right? So here's our title called React App. Evan's React App. Save it. Refresh. There you got Evan's React App. Point is, underneath the title, Evan's React App, this is bundle.js. And this bundle is doing a lot of generation of our HTML for us. So that's just a script worth pointing out. And just like before, when you have static resources that you want to serve up that aren't changing, you put it inside of public. But you put the more dynamic code, which turns out is going to be most of the code that we write, you put that inside of the source folder. Okay, you're going to notice an app CSS, app.js, and an index.js. And these are kind of the two files that I want to look at, index.js and app.js. Kind of start right here. This is the starting line for our JavaScript. Again, notice we're using the newer ES modules, right? We're doing imports here, just like we're used to. We're importing some CSS files from our local CSS, right? That's right here, index.css, current directory. Notice we're importing this thing called app, importing app from app. And right here on line 10, this is a component. Line 10 is a component. So there's a component that is coded. The component is called app, and we're importing app from the app.js. Notice there's not a .js here. It's just import app from app. And then here we're coding this like an HTML tag. App / is kind of a what you call a self-closing tag. And here's a little bit of JavaScript that says, hey, go ahead and get an element by the ID of root, right? We looked at that. Here's our root. So get the ID of root, call it root, and render basically this thing called app. Okay. So that's what index.js is. Index.js is our starting JavaScript file, and all it does is it gets our HTML element and says, hey, inside of that HTML element, go ahead and render, draw whatever this app thing is. So let's look at app. App is interesting, but I like to break it down, right? So there's kind of three things going on. You've got an import, you've got a function, and you export that function. And so that's the workflow. If you're going to create a component, this is the workflow at the basics. Import what you need, you're going to write a JavaScript function, and you're going to export that function. Inside this function, notice this function has a return, and you're going to return something that looks like HTML. This is our JSX, by the way. This is JSX. Notice this line of code right here, line 8, has these curly braces on it. Now you're not used to really seeing that so much in your HTML. Normally your source attribute has quotes, just like all our other attributes in HTML. They have quotes. But this is saying, hey, there's a JavaScript variable called logo. You imported that logo on line 1. Go ahead and put in that logo inside of our image. Right? So this is JSX. This is combining HTML and JavaScript kind of in one language, which is cool. Now, and this is, so we write our function. Our function has a return, and then we export that. So just for the sake of hello world, let's do this, right? Let's go ahead and delete what's in there. Let's make a div and say hello world. And so now our function, our component, if you will, our component is called app. Our app just says hello world. We come back and there it says hello world. Very interesting to me. This is new. This font. Why is this font Roboto? It used to not be Roboto. So normally you get this kind of serif font by default in the browser, but we have a default font of Roboto. So Roboto is a Google font, typically. And this is coming from index.css on the body. So on index.css, okay, well there you go. There's your CSS that's being applied. Which is fine. I don't think Roboto is built into our OS, but maybe it is nowadays. Okay, you got Hello World up and running?
Yep.
Cool. Do this. If you get rid of the div, save. Obviously, I'm expecting this not to work. And you can see here that doesn't work, right? So one thing to note is that, better yet, let's do this. Let's do h1 hello world, h2 hello world 2. Okay, this is better. This is a better example of something not working. And you could see here a JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So basically what that means, and I just want to point this out because I've run into this a lot, you have to have a parent. And so this works if you have a parent container. And so you could do something like div, okay? And notice now, hello world and hello world 2. The point is JSX kind of has this requirement that you have a parent. And so there has to be one parent. As soon as I introduce another parent, now there's no parent, right? Now these are siblings. These are sibling elements which won't work. Okay. The error message said, hey, you can even have these things called fragments, which are just literally tags like this. So you don't have to introduce markup like divs that you don't use. And so this is what's called a JSS fragment. It's just basically an empty, it's obviously just empty, and now there's one parent. It's nothing, but that kind of gets you away from introducing div tags that you don't need in your code. So that's called the JSX fragment. So again, this is JSX, this is app. Let's build our own component. Let's build a component called header. And so I'm going to introduce header.js. Notice the convention. I'm just following their convention. Header.js. And this is going to be a function called header. And we are going to export default header. And here I'll have a fragment. Let me do this. There we go. Okay. So our function has no parameters. Doesn't like those spaces. This is my header tag with an h1. This is my header component. Okay, so we've got, now just kind of glancing here, we don't have any logos or any CSS, so this header really doesn't need any imports at this point. I'm going to go back to index.js and let's import header from header. And let's replace app with header. And it says app is defined but never used. Export default app. Let me troubleshoot this real quick. Don't forget the keyword return. Your function has to return your JSX. There we go. Okay, this is my header component. And now that we've done that, it is reusable. So of course, now you can be self-closing, or it's actually kind of interesting. I can go header like such with the self-closing tag, and that works. Just to demonstrate, we can do it again. It's kind of like creating your own tags, right? That's what a component is. We've used the header component twice inside of root. There you see 2 headers. Not semantic, but it's just getting the point across. I think, to start, doing hello world, start making your own components. Making your own components pretty simple. They're just a JavaScript function with don't forget the return like I did. You have to have one parent, and then you can write some markup in there. Maybe let's do a let data equals 2, and then in here we can say data. And so whenever you see these curly braces, we're kind of entering JavaScript land. And so now you could see that merging of JavaScript into the HTML with this JSX. These can be nested. Okay, so check this out. So right now we've got 2 components. We've got app and we've got header. Our index just calls on header. Let's bring that back to app. Right. I would say largely keep this app. Okay, app is kind of like the parent. You might change that, I guess, but I think the convention is inside of app, right? That's kind of your root. And maybe we just say, okay, I want header inside of app. Now, notice here I didn't import it, so let's just click on this and see. It should import header from header. So that's pretty smart. And again, this nesting works, right? You can nest components inside of other components, just like HTML, right? You can have H1s inside of divs. Okay. Well, this theory is just over an hour long. That's the hello world and the theory behind React that I wanted to start. Before I get into this project that we're going to do, which is a lab. So this is a good stopping point. We've done hello world in React, and I'm going to stop this video here.